তেলেঙ্গানা 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 হাতে হাতে রাইফেল আছে নিশানা তেলেঙ্গানা 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 তেলেঙ্গানা.
Greetings, listeners, to podcast 24. I've decided to move these podcasts onto YouTube. The visuals will be limited on these. You can listen to these as audio podcasts. I'll put on a few visuals for reference purposes onto the casts so you can follow along, but the visuals are not what it's about. These are primarily audio podcasts. So in the interests of just making these more accessible and easier for people to access, they'll be put on YouTube from now on. So simply type my name, Dennis Redmond, that's DennisRedmond, into the YouTube search function, and my podcasts and videos will pop up for you right away. 2 topics for this week: Assassin's Creed 3, the main storyline, and the portable version of Assassin's Creed 3, Liberation. Assassin's Creed 3 can be defined in a single phrase as a glorious missed opportunity. The game is very, very uneven. There are parts of the game that work wonderfully well. The design team is incredibly skilled. They brought tremendous talent and energy to the game, and parts of the game work extremely well. And the unfortunate thing is all these parts don't quite add up to a single experience. When the game starts off, you are in 18th century Britain, and there are a number of very exciting missions that you start out with. There's a theater mission, there's a mission on board a ship. You head off to the New World. Not that the world was particularly new, there were people living there, of course, but be that as it may, you land in pre-revolutionary Boston, and that's when everything starts to fall apart. One of the problems with the game, the sheer number of individual mechanics, mini-games, side quests, and that's a bonus in most other games. That would be added content to other franchises. And unfortunately, the sheer number and quality of these side missions tends to detract from the main mission. The biggest problem with Assassin's Creed 3 is that it lacks a compelling core. It lacks a gameplay and a style which would tie everything together. This is interesting because if you think about, say, the Grand Theft Auto games, some of them are better than others, people have their own favorites, but at their best, they were always greater than the sum of their sometimes very clunky parts. The individual missions inside of a Grand Theft Auto game would oftentimes be horribly done and lackadaisical and patched together, and yet the overall effect worked because it fit with the game world. It was funny, it was exciting, the series had a tremendous sense of humor. Assassin's Creed 3 is somehow less than the sum of its parts. And the lack of the emotional core, this is not the fault, by the way, of the voice actors, who are terrific. Adrian Hugh does a very fine job as Hatham's voice actor. Noah Watts is fantastic as the main protagonist, Connor. And of course, Nolan North is there to deliver his usual standard of excellence as Desmond. Nolan North is such a good voice actor that we sort of routinely expect excellence from him, but he consistently delivers it. No one remarks at how difficult it is to not dial it in, to constantly maintain that level, but he manages to do that. So the voice actors do a very, very fine job. And the problem is, the voice acting talent is squandered by some really questionable script writing decisions. A lot of reviewers actually noticed this, saying that the main character, Connor, was simply not a terribly compelling character. He was a very one-dimensional character, angry, filled with sort of vengeance. Why is he not an interesting character? Vengeance should be a fascinating subject. The whole God of War franchise has turned vengeance into one of its main principles and has consistently made it interesting. Well, one of the reasons here is the God of War franchise knew enough to paint in the culture of ancient Greece and antiquity and give us a sense of what that culture entailed. These were city-states that had a slave mode of production, very violent hierarchies, and therefore that sort of social reality, it was there in the game world in terms of this very brutal world of slaves and masters and slave uprisings against the masters. And the problem with Assassin's Creed 3 is, despite the fact that it's set in Revolutionary War and it's supposedly about a revolution, nothing terribly revolutionary happens inside of the characters. There's an interesting contradiction there. Connor, for instance, he is from one of the Mohawk cultures in Northeast America. And one of the problems with the character is that we learn very little about Connor's own community, his culture, or his people. This is really, really, really surprising. We spend a lot of time as Connor growing up and some of the early missions, and yet we learn almost nothing about the the character or the culture. And the problem here is not negative stereotyping. I would argue that this is actually a very postmodern problem of a generic positive stereotyping. Essentially, Connor is playing the role of the generic hero of color who just happens to be a certain race or color, etc. But he is this very stereotypical character. He loses his family and he wants vengeance, and that's it. He's not a rounded individual. He doesn't have quirks or peccadillos. There aren't little things that differentiate him from other people, which any human being would have. I'm not sure what happened with the script writing here. There was an experienced team working on the script. The writers, Corey May and Danny Wallace, they did do a fine job on the Britishness of the script. This is 18th century America, so they had to make that real. They did a good job there. They provided a lot of British colored context, which works fairly well. The problem, though, is there's something missing at the very heart of Connor's character. One of the clues here is that creative director Alex Hutchison worked previously on Army of Two. It's a shooter franchise, and it's possible that the very toxic identity politics of the shooter may have made Hutchison unaware of the patriarchal and particularly the imperial legacies of the shooter. This is something that shooters must confront. If they do not confront the crash and burn of the American Empire, they will have nothing to say the 21st century, or any other century for that matter. One of the big problems here is a over-reliance on tropes and themes of warfare, and it just becomes blatantly obvious about halfway through the game that this game was created for a primarily Anglo-American audience who regards warfare as something very distant and historical, as set-piece battles and Civil War and Revolutionary War reconstructions, and the reality of the awfulness of war escaped the scriptwriters. Other problems. Biggest problem of all in terms of gameplay. How could they not perfect stealth after 3 iterations of the series? The stealth sections are surprisingly clunky, and the stealth techniques which you use are mostly unnecessary, underutilized, simply not necessary to complete a lot of the missions. There's a kind of a crude way to put this. Assassin's Creed 3 plays like Grand Theft Stabbo. You just go around and stab things. That's the primary motivation. After a while, it's not terribly interesting. There isn't enough variation. And this is where the problem with the side quests and the missions comes in, because they're not really hooked up to the main storyline. They don't really feed into the development of your character in any significant way, and it ends up being very routinized. So you have this big, beautiful open world, and I do want to commend the design team for creating a wonderful world. The frontier looks like the frontier. The Northeast really does look like the Northeast. The nature, the sounds of birds, the color of the sky, all these things are beautifully rendered. You have a wonderful open world to work with. But it's empty. It's like this giant nature park. It's just not that interesting because it's not filled with stories and narratives that we really care about. And a lot of the tracking and nature elements are not as well done as what other video games have managed to do. These problems lead to specific moments which really break the immersion and break the game. One of the best examples here is a sequence set inside of a prison, and this is game-breaking for a number of reasons. First of all, Connor's capture is not credible. You've just been in the process of stabbing half the British army to death, and someone comes up and knocks you out in one blow. And your reaction as a player character is, right, tell me a story, tell me a fable. Give me some reason that I should be trapped or captured. But this ludicrous, well, I said the wrong thing and I just got knocked out. This totally flies against the character that has been constructed previously. So there's a script writing problem right there. Second, the jail sequence is really mishandled. You can free run, you have a lot of your movement techniques inside of the jail. This is a game breaker. Jails are not nice places. They're crowded. They were full of squalor. 18th century jails were miserable, horrible places. They were dungeons, essentially. And the fact that you can kind of free run on the rail of a balustrade inside of the jail in the midst of a prison with the guards not really paying any attention, that crosses the line to game breaking. What should have happened there is the game should have put some constraints on your movement. Assassin's Creed 3 is always about movement and free running. So to emphasize the loss of that, they should have made it very hard for your character to move around. Slow the character down, not allow certain kinds of movement to give you the sense of being in coercion, that you're under control and restraint and can't do certain things, and that would have worked very well. Instead, it ends up just being the standard, oh, well, I'm in this jail, but I'll get out quick as can be, and it's not really a problem. So it's not threatening to your character, it's not constraining, it doesn't do the job that it should do, which is sort of a mid-check on your progress to think about some of the deeper issues of imprisonment versus freedom. Now, the bright spots in the story It is true, the ocean battle sequences are spectacular, they're really well handled, they're completely unrealistic, and that's of course why they succeed so well. They basically compress 10, 12-hour sea battles, and in some cases they would go on for more than one day, and in actual, in real life, they compress those into 5 and 6 minutes. Not realistic at all, but extremely well done, great fun, easy enough that you can get through them the first time, but also hard enough that the higher difficulty levels, they will give you run for your money and are challenging. So that part is done very well. And again, one of the problems here is it's this one moment in this vast assemblage of mini quests and missions, and it doesn't really add to the character. You run into this problem of, okay, you have power over the sea, why not do more with that? And again, it becomes this mechanic that the game gives you a little glimpse of what it could have been and then withdraws that power all over again. The biggest problem with Assassin's Creed 3 may be more structural than in terms of the gameplay mechanics, and that is there is not a central plot mechanic around which the entire franchise can rest. And so it ends up being just a collection of parts precisely because there is no core. One of the problems here, the science fiction overplot, is a complete mess. It's not the slightest bit credible. I'm not sure what they were thinking here. It may be that they just had this kind of overplot and they fed it in and they thought, well, okay, and worked with it and tried to feed and tried to make it work. The problem is, after 3 iterations of the series, you need to solidify the plot. You need to give your players a sense of why they should care about Desmond and what's going on in the near future. And that's never really satisfactorily explained. Instead, we get cosmic catastrophes, we get science fiction, we get voices from the past, we get some crazy AIs running loose. It just becomes less and less and less and less credible, and to the point is, okay, yeah, I'm just being led down, I'm being led down the garden path here, and this is the same problem as the 18th century sections, which are, you're being led down the garden path into these really beautiful sequences that don't have an emotional core. The science fiction stories are the same way. There's no ideological core there. There's no belief system. There's no sense of reality. There's no sense that you are part of this resistance movement, that what you're doing is right, that the situation is dire, but there's some hope for humanity. In the end, you just feel like a pawn being used by other powers, and there's no good, there's no evil. The ideological material, precisely because it doesn't have a critique of neoliberalism, and this may relate to the problem of science fiction franchises have this problem that if they don't cognize their moment of history, they can fall back into imperial barbarism. Mass Effect, classic example of this. It wanted to do the right thing, and it ends up just waging these wars of imperial aggression and then displacing that violence onto the Reapers. That, oh yes, they're the really, really, really evil people out there, and we needed to blow them up. So it's the terror war logic, and because it's not reflecting about what is violence, where does it come from, how does society is generated, it ends up reiterating the system instead of critiquing it. Assassin's Creed 3 is better than this. It's a deeper narrative, and one of the reasons there is that it accesses history and at least tries to address some of the root causes of the American Revolution, some of the issues around freedom, and then it stumbles because it can't really make that playable. Ultimately, I think the biggest problem with the Assassin's Creed franchise is that it's trying to tell a binary set of stories in a world which is not binary at all. And there's a great contradiction there, because you'd think Assassin's Creed, it's all about freedom of choice and movement. Well, yeah, on one level, that's true, but what can you do inside of that game world? Free running is not a narrative experience past a certain point. It's a transport mechanic, but you have to give that narrative content. What is the narrative content? And that's where the series has always kind of struggled to try to create stuff. Maybe the best of the series were the episodes set in the Renaissance, and one of the reasons there is that both the physical environments of the Renaissance Italy city-states were rendered beautifully, and the scale of city-states are small enough to make the lack of character development work. Whereas with Revolutionary War, you need an epic character to step up to the plate, and there isn't that epic character. And again, that's no fault of the voice actors. They did as best they could with the material. That's the fault of the franchise writers not thinking through the material in a sufficient way. Now, there's a tremendous irony here. When we think about conspiracy narratives, and Assassin's Creed 3 is basically a subgenre of the conspiracy theory, the idea that there's a small elite that controls history and there are battles within that elite. Conspiracy narratives, by their very definition, if they don't have a historical vision, turn back into what they attempt to critique. That is, they reduce collective agency to this vessel, this technology, a plaything of vested interests which are always displaced elsewhere. Them. What began as a protest against dehumanization has a worrying propensity to turn back into its reaffirmation. People end up being blamed for the system which dehumanized them. And again, one of the surest signs that this happened with Assassin's Creed 3 is the main story arc. The biggest problem with its ending, this is not a spoiler because the game has been out for some time, when Connor has to confront his father at the very end of the story, that's a scene that has no emotional impact. You have to think back to even the most neoconservative franchises, say the original Star Wars movies. As a narrative universe, very rich and productive, politics are sometimes problematic, but had a great sense of design and style. The original trilogy had the good sense to redeem the Darth Vader figure at the very last second. A little stagey, a little clunky, but it was right. It actually violated its own neoconservative canon, which is always about punishment and empire and discipline, threw that out at the very end and allowed a moment of redemption. And that is why the original series is so powerful and has resonated for decades since then. The true villain in the end was the Empire and Imperial War, not some guy in black robes and a face mask. So there's this central cognition still there, even in a neoconservative narrative. It could come up with that sort of critique of empire in a very limited and distorted way, to be sure, but it was still there. Assassin's Creed 3 just doesn't know where to go with this. It has no critique of empire. It kind of gets it, but if you think about it, all the problems that I've mentioned can be traced back to the central problem of not cognizing empire. Connor's people, they're not fleshed out as a culture or people or society precisely because that would run against empire. All the game mechanics, they're not set up in a certain way because empires are all about money-making and business-making and not about questioning why the empire exists or for who the empire's been constructed. And in the very end, you get this artificial ending of, okay, the old elite is destroyed, and the logical reading that you could have at that very last scene, when, okay, the bad guys are dispatched, is, well, yeah, now a new elite steps up to the plate to commit the same acts of violence and mayhem and murder that the old elite. That's a very sort of post-colonial reading of the material, I know, and maybe stretching it a little bit, but that, then again, there isn't anything in the material that would contradict that reading either. So the final irony we're left with is we have this glorious documentation of a revolutionary moment and revolutionary history, which itself is deeply unrevolutionary and static and binary and wants to go back, I would argue, to an almost pre-18th century vision of history being an additive linear process of stepwise enlightenment. At the same time, that precisely because that vision is falling apart and not credible, our historical moment when the American Empire is not credible and losing power around the world, there are alternatives that need to be expressed. And the narrative can't quite get there. It goes around and around and around, and it tries to get there, but it can't imagine a new American Revolution. It can't imagine an alternate history. It can't imagine pushing the material still further and ask, where were the women in the American Revolutionary War? Where were people of color? What about slavery? All these issues, they're there, they're hinted at a little bit here and there, but then they're not explicitly talked about or explored in depth, and the result is it ends up being a journey through a history museum, but not a history museum that's going to teach you much about history. It's a history museum that's been carefully sanitized of any kind of resistant content. In a strange kind of way, it ends up reaffirming the lack of choice, which the whole point of the franchise is to emphasize. The whole point of the franchise is that choice matters. And yet you're given this narrative universe where it really doesn't matter. What you do, the die is cast in advance. And that's the contradiction it cannot unravel. I hope that the design team in the future thinks about this and asks the question, what would choice mean in a video game? What would choice mean? What would history mean? And what do our historical choices mean? It doesn't mean you have to rewrite history or falsify the history. It just means you have to think about the chances that were lost, the things that could not have been done as possibilities, to open up history in a more complicated way. I hope they do that in the future. Okay, our second story, Assassin's Creed 3 launched with a companion game on the PlayStation Vita, portable game. Now, mobile gaming is very much in its infancy for a lot of structural reasons due to the hardware and battery technology and ease of use and so forth. So there are going to be the usual teething difficulties in terms of controls and layouts, so I'm not going to critique the game from that standpoint. However, Everything which I've said about the problems of Assassin's Creed 3, in terms of that lack of an emotional core, the lack of a compelling storyline, the lack of a compelling character, and ultimately the lack of a compelling vision of history, those come back to haunt Assassin's Creed 3 Liberation in a major, major way, and this is very painful. This is actually a game that I had a lot of hope for, and I really, really wish the design team had hit it out of the park, and what we're left with is just really a fragment of what could have been. Enormous potential, almost completely unrealized. Now, that said, as a game, its mechanics are reasonably solid. It is a solid introduction, considering that the Vita is a new platform, a new system. It's the first true open-world game for the Vita. It does have horsepower to do this, and the design team, I believe it was Ubisoft Sofia was the design team, worked very, very hard to bring the game world to life. And many aspects of the game world are beautifully rendered and done on the platform. It's set in New Orleans in the 18th century. The city environments, the bayou, the Caribbean environments are extraordinarily well done and beautiful to witness and play through, and the sound is very well done. So it's not the game world itself, or it's not the visual aspects of the game world. It's the playable aspects of the game world and the narrative aspects which really bog down. And one of the reasons here, surprisingly, is some very uneven character writing and script writing. The voice actors, by the way, all do a very fine job, so this is not the fault of voice actors or lack of delivery. They work very hard. It's just that the script itself and the storyline itself lacks material. And this is a shocking contradiction, because if you've ever read the press reviews or read the reviews or know a little bit about the press coverage of the game, this is a game that does try to address the issues of race and gender in the 18th century. And that's actually breaking some new ground. So it's not just some white guy hero. Aveline, the main protagonist of the game, is an African-American character. Her mom was a slave, freed by a French citizen / American, and it's unclear. New Orleans was sort of under control of several colonial authorities in the 18th century. That should have been a source of some really, really sophisticated and complicated script writing. And instead, and this great opportunity just vanishes, and we're left with, I hate to say this, but we're sort of left with Grand Theft Petticoat. And I'm referring to the character mechanic by which you dress up your character to do certain things. And one of the limitations there is you have to, as a game mechanic, it's fairly effective because it allows you to choose different strategies and techniques. And one of the problems here is, because the system is sort of in lieu of a skill tree system, it locks you into doing certain things. If you choose the wrong outfit or getup at the beginning of a mission, you're pretty much locked in, and you'd have to restart the whole thing all over again. It's sort of limiting what the character can do in certain situations, which tends to work against the open world game. It's more of an artificial constraint than an enabling system per se. Now, despite that, there are flashes of brilliance in the game. There are moments when it works really well. One of the really sad things that happens in the game is that the further the game progresses, and it's around halfway through the game, that the lack of script writing really starts to bite the game world very, very hard. And the reason is that the motivations of the characters start to melt away. None of the plot lines really go anywhere. They're not really tied to the local history. And this is really surprising, because Ubisoft did spend time to establish the background. One of their staffers, I think it was Maxime Durand, worked as the historical coordinator of the franchise to get the history right. The main scriptwriter for the game, Richard Farisi, is an experienced writer. And I think the problem here runs deeper than just a studio biting off a little more than it can chew. I think the historical problem here is an inability to think through that particular context, New Orleans in the 18th century. The game does not know how to access the neo-slave narrative. It's a rather blunt statement, and I know that sort of flies against the face of what you might think, because there are moments in the side quests and whatnot which do refer to neo-slave narratives. And in fact, it's always talking about slavery and slaves being abducted and rescuing slaves and so on and so forth. There's a reason for this. Neo-slave narratives are some of the most interesting innovations in the epoch of late neoliberalism. They're basically the stories of the people that never had stories. They're stories of the people who endured the Middle Passage, Africans taken from that continent and brought to America to be slaves. The indentured servants from India brought to the Caribbean and elsewhere. The people that worked on the plantations in Indonesia and Vietnam, oftentimes taken from other countries or even from other places within that local culture. And basically, as the name Shanghai, the old verb shanghaied, meant to be forcibly clapped up in irons and taken as slaves, essentially, to work somewhere else. And the name comes from that long and dire colonial history. Assassin's Creed Liberation does not know how to access this history, and it ends up substituting melodrama and a sort of fictive quest for personal vengeance on someone in its lieu. This is very obvious in terms of some of the characters that you have to fight against later in the storyline are very one-dimensional. So first they appear to be good, then they flip over and they're entirely evil. And that's a classic sign of a script that wasn't fully baked in. They didn't really know what to do, they didn't know what they were aiming at, they didn't know what to critique, how to critique a system of slavery. Well, the neo-slave narratives do something interesting by humanizing the everyday life world of slaves, of the enslaved, and making that, and writing stories which we don't actually have the records, but we can guess from the archaeology and what the masters said, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we can have an imaginative depiction of what might have been. And that imagination that might have been does restitution to those who were never given the opportunity to tell their own stories. And unfortunately, Assassin's Creed Liberation doesn't get there. We have a character who is fairly elite and well-off and part of the sort of octoroon, quadroon aristocracy of color within New Orleans, which always existed in many ways, even under the U.S. South and the Confederacy. It still existed. It doesn't know how to move beyond that social strata, so it ends up being this kind of very small-scale personal vengeance narrative, and just a huge missed opportunity that doesn't know how to go anywhere. Maybe the one place where this is most obvious, the sequence is set presumably in the Caribbean or Mexico in the context of some other slave plantation. Those really, really, really bog down. They turn into what you might call the caving and diving adventure. Essentially neoliberal tourism, straight out of the Indiana Jones playbook. Very little narrative tension there. Visually adequate and reasonably fun the first time, but nothing that you'd ever want to come back to because that has been done so many times by so many other genres and narratives. And the storyline just doesn't give us enough reason to really care. We do it once and okay, been there, done that. The ultimate problem here, and this is something that I would hope game studios think more deeply about, you have to invest the same resources into the narrative as the open world itself. This is one thing to be learned from Grand Theft Auto in terms of game design, is that you can no longer just throw a bunch of mechanics together and expect that to be a video game. That was fine for the early 2000s, but as the game worlds have gotten richer, deeper, more complex, more sophisticated, that comes with an added challenge. You must have a central narrative or storyline or principle of some kind to bind all those things together. The more freedom you give the players, the more things that they can do inside the game world, the more realistic and exciting the events inside that game world, the greater the need for a narrative to back that up, for characters which are interesting. They don't have to be perfect. They don't have to be 100%, but they at least need to be dynamic and interesting characters and change a little bit. They don't have to change a whole lot, but they need to have that humanity inside them. Now, the Uncharted series has found a way to do this. Some mysterious alchemy. The design team there has worked wonders. Nathan Drake doesn't change that much in the course of the storylines, but he does change a little. He's always a little sadder and wiser at the end of the story. And the point is, he's human. He's constantly rethinking what he's done, and he's as approachable, and that works for that context. I would also argue that there are limitations with that strategy, which are starting to become apparent. I think the Uncharted series probably needs to develop its female characters and the non-white characters to a much greater extent to make that game world more credible in the future. Still, even with those confines, they got that storyline and they got the characterization right. That's where Assassin's Creed really needs to rethink its whole strategy. Building these beautiful, empty, glittering shells of a game world, but that don't have the emotional core. And in a strange kind of way, the science fiction overplot of the Assassin's Creed stories, in a grim kind of way, is sort of the truth of the entire series. It really is just this simulation. It's this empty game between two digital sides that are just mirror images of each other. Why should we bother playing? I hope the design teams sit down and give us a reason to play, because the teams are fantastically skilled and there's a lot that works really well in the games, and the worlds that they build on the local level are very compelling and beautiful and wonderful. But they need to step up their game in the future. All right, that's all the time we have for this week. Next week, I'll have a review of a game that does get the emotional core of its storyline right, in an environment that you wouldn't expect, and the game in question is Far Cry 3, one of the more pleasant surprises this holiday season. So until then.
Eres el elegido, avanza siempre erguido. Evita caminar por el camino destruido. En la vida hay un propósito, busca tu lugar. El tiempo es un juego, apréndelo a jugar. Que hoy es otro día, no es igual que ayer. La confianza en uno mismo para poder vencer. Es fácil elevarse y tener una